Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Challenging Faith podcast. I have to have this conversation with you. I have to have it with me personally. I want to hear your thoughts about this, right? So this is an ongoing conversation. It'll probably be 2 episodes, just so that we can go deep into what is Christian nationalism. And so I got to tell you a story to kind of set the conversation, because when I was a pastor in the United States, in one of the churches that I was working at, we were having a conversation about doing a Spanish service in the evening. So as you know, the Latino population is growing drastically in the United States. I don't know if you knew this part, but Latinos in general tend to be more conservative, right? So if you think about liberals, progressives, conservatives in the context of the U.S., even though most of my Republican friends would say, well, Latinos mostly vote Democrats because it's more progressive, you'd be surprised that more Latinos are more in terms traditional views of marriage, of family, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm saying all that because where I was pastoring in North Carolina, there was a drastically growing population of Latinos. And there was a desire in my heart, hey, why don't we have a Spanish service so we can reach out to the growing Latino community in this context. The long story short, as we're having the discussion, leaders, other pastors, etc., one of my, not one of my only requests, the only request that I had at one of those meetings was, we need to make sure that this gathering is officially a sanctuary. You can, as a church, as a nonprofit organization, as a religious organization, declare yourself a sanctuary, which means the people that are coming know when you're in this space, it's not going to be our responsibility to call the cops on you if you don't have your immigration papers, for example. Yes, it's our responsibility if we find out that you're abusing somebody to report that. Yes. But what I'm saying is, in the context of gathering Latinos for an evening service, where the majority of the people that would come were people who were in the U.S. without their immigration papers. We would say undocumented people. I wouldn't say illegal people, because you drive over the speed limit and I don't call you an illegal, and you're breaking the law. And so there's different elements of narrative that we use. We say those are illegals, wetbacks who are illegal. That's offensive. That's racist. That's just ungodly. But unfortunately, I was surrounded by people who were Christians, not just Christians, charismatic Christians, who would say, well, if Latinos who are undocumented, if illegals come to this church, God's going to tell me who the illegals are, and I'm going to call the agencies so that they can take them out. And the narrative would be, I'm helping these illegals because I'm helping them not be illegal, and they can go back to their countries and then they'll stop being illegals. It's a misuse of scripture, of just basic human decency. It's a misuse of law. And so I'm not an expert, right? I think we've established that clearly in this podcast, that I'm not the experts in these matters. I'm coming to you with personal experience as in 18 years of full-time church ministry, as somebody who's leading an organization, doing work on the ground, and as somebody who's growing in his journey, in my personal journey. And so I have to frame everything through sincerity, not expertise, because I'm not an expert. But I want to be sincere. That's the first thing. And number 2, I want to bring that sincerity through the lens of the gospel. And so what if we look at what Jesus said? And so if we want to talk about immigration, we have one verse in Matthew 25 where Jesus says, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me. Now, that's why it's important to have this conversation about Christian nationalism, because when we say America is a Christian nation, like Puerto Ricans can say Puerto Rico is a Christian island. When we use that language, if you reduce the nation into a human and you say, okay, well, Christians, when they get slapped on the face, according to Christ, who they say they're following, are meant to put their other cheek. Christians, when somebody owes them a debt, they're meant to forgive those debts. Christians, when somebody's offended them, you're meant to forgive them. Christians, right? So if you think of the individual as a Christian, and then you compare that to a nation, do nations just forgive other nations' debts? Do nations, when they get hit by another nation, don't hit back, right? And so that's why we have to discuss this, because the very notion of Christian and nation, or Christianity, or being a Christian nationalist, is an oxymoron. It's impossible to be one or the other. Let me just go back to the story. I'm having this conversation. Let's have a Spanish service in the evenings. I need this to be declared a sanctuary. So my Latino friends who are coming, who I'm inviting to come to church, right? So we're creating this atmosphere of worship, of giving, of surrender, of praying for each other, of doing community. I need them to know without a shadow of a doubt that if they're here with us, nobody's going to be calling ICE, which is the agency that would, come and get them and send them back to wherever they came from. That's the language. That's what I'm battling in this meeting. And I'm saying the one thing we have to do, we have to declare this a sanctuary. The voices started coming. We can't do that. That's a political statement. That's what a Democrat would do. So we're having a conversation about human beings in the context of community, in the context of scripture. Jesus says, welcome the stranger. And it immediately turns into political party says this, other political party thinks that. It becomes this convoluted conversation, and it ends up with, who do we worship? Well, we worship the nation. And this nation who is ruled by law, and these people are not from this nation, so we have to kick them out of this nation. That's why Christian nationalism is an oxymoron. As you can imagine, we never started that service because I wasn't going to be part of a place that was unsafe for my migrant brothers and sisters. And there was no interest really to serve that community in that context, which is extremely, extremely sad. It's a loss for everybody. So Christian nationalism. Christianity, at its core, it's following Jesus. If you say you're a Christian, we say we're Christians, the main thing is not to believe in Jesus, which is like the most basic, it's basically evangelicalism. Look at me. Evangelismo, el evangelio. Evangelism, or being an evangelical, being one who spreads the good news. The language that we use is we're believers of Jesus. But Jesus never once asked us to believe in him. Jesus asked us to follow him. And that is completely different interaction with the person of Jesus. We're used to that, right? I believe in Jesus. And listen, I think it's clear by episode 11. I think this is episode 11, not 10 or 11. Episode 11, by episode 11, I think despite the pains that I suffered at church, despite the pains that I've struggles and the questions that I have, and despite the challenge that I want to bring to church, to local church, to pastors, despite the turmoil, my internal struggles in this journey of believing or not believing, I think it's kind of clear I do believe in Jesus. That's something that I can say comfortably, and I can say it in the questions and the journey and the doubt. No problem. I'm comfortable with that. But I'm not trying to be a believer of Jesus. I'm trying to be a follower of Jesus, because Jesus said, come and follow me. Yes, there's scripture in the New Testament, of course. For those who believe in their hearts and confess with their mouth, that's Romans 10. I can preach it, guys. I was a pastor for 18 years, so I get it. There's the invitation. Come and believe in Jesus. Come to the front. Put your hand right here. Let somebody pray with you. Do this prayer. There's tears. I'm not devaluing that. It would be silly of me to devalue the power of belief. But Jesus said to follow him. Right? Let's be with that. Let's sit with that. Come and follow me. He was a rabbi. He has disciples, which means people who are learning from him. Being a disciple means a learner, somebody who's learning. So in the journey of following, you're learning. Learning what? Learning how to act like him, how to sound like him, how to love like him, how to feed others like him, how to do miracles like him, how to give your life for others like him. So the whole point of following Jesus is learning to be like Jesus. And in the context of the nation, I'm a Christian nationalist. One is going to rule over the other. And usually, unfortunately, is the worship of the nation that dominates the worship of the Christ, or the service of the Christ, or more importantly, following Christ. Catherine Stewart says, I'm going to read her quote, Christian nationalism is an ideology. It's not a faith. It's not a religion. It's an ideology that demands a merger of civic life with a particular version of Christianity. It is often linked with far-right political ideologies, xenophobia, and the opposition to the separation of church and state. Christian nationalism is an oxymoron because it's two conflicting ideologies battling with one another. Let me give you the definition. Christian nationalism is not a religion or a form of Christianity. It is a cultural framework that blends myths of America, myths of manifest destiny, myths of these people were chosen over these people. It blends traditions, symbolism, narratives, and values, promoting that fusion of Christianity with whatever nation it is. Now, obviously, I'm talking about Christian nationalism because as a Christian, this is the conversation that I'm having, that we're having. But nationalism blends with all the other religions too. You can have Jewish nationalism. You can have Islamic nationalism. There are states in the world right now that are religious states. What does that mean? That the state, the political framework of that state was merged with the faith ideology and it became the powers that be. So when I was growing up, my dad in Puerto Rico, we would say, es un nacionalista. He's a nationalist for Puerto Rico. And so we've talked about this already. We're recording here in an American colony. We're second-class citizens of the U.S. We have certain rights, not full rights. We're taxed but not represented. We can't vote for the president, for example, but we can go die in American wars, even though we can't vote for the commander-in-chief. You get what I'm saying. You Americans went to war with Britain because you lived in conditions like the ones we're living in right now. And so my dad was in his young days was one of those radical nationalists, right? Like we need freedom from the imperialist America and we need to be liberated and we need freedom. And there's a whole movement and it wasn't big in numbers, but it was powerful in influence. And I grew up in that. I grew up with that language. My dad was very comfortable, like teaching us history. And to make the long story short, you know those moments when you're a kid and you really want to connect with maybe a mother, a father, or a parent, and you almost want to sound like them because if you mimic, that's one of the things. Like sometimes you show love by mimicking. It just happened to me today. I was talking to somebody, I like that person, and they went like this, and without even thinking, I went like this because when you mimic people, it's kind of a way to say, I'm with you, I'm connected. That's just human nature. And so as a child, even more towards my dad, I want to mimic my dad. I want to mimic his language. And so we're watching something on the news. I can't remember what we're watching, but I start going like, oh yeah, because the US, they do this and they did that and the other. And my dad completely turned the tables. And I'm so grateful that even though he's very certain of his convictions, he also has the capacity to view all the points and to be a person that really lives the big table, the open table, even when he has clarity about his convictions. And I'm trying to mimic my dad and America, and they did this, and the U.S. imperialism. I'm using big words for a kid. And my dad says this. He asked me the question, what if it was us? What if us Puerto Ricans eventually became an empire and we had all the power? How would we act? What would we do with that power? How would we rule? How would we treat other nations that were smaller than us? And him asking that question threw me off guard, number one, because I'm just trying to impress my dad. And number two, because it was the right question to ask. Like, what about us when we have the power? And so I think it's one of the most integral parts of the message of Jesus is how to fight power. Actually, how to fight our hunger for power. Our hunger to rule, our hunger to be ahead. And Jesus used language that was very direct against that. He who is last shall be first. It's like you have this mentality, go to the front, be number one. And Jesus is saying it's actually the ones way at the back. It's the ones that serve. Those are the ones that are number one in the kingdom. It's the ones that give. It's the ones that, because Jesus has this sequence where he goes from, you have to love your neighbor as yourself. Then he goes to like, you have to love your neighbor all the way to give your life for them. Like your friends, I'm giving my life for my friends. Do the same for your friends. And so there's this progression, this growth that just the notion of nation. And let me just, because I want to specifically say this in a way of comparing Christian nationalism and what Christ said to all the nations, independently what nation it is. This is what Jesus said. So Christian nationalism says, our country is blessed. It's manifest destiny. Our ways are superior. Our constitution or our rule of law or whatever we establish, our Magna Carta, that's the one who's divine. God chose us. And so Christian nationalism is constantly trying to use language of priority, of number one, of the nation, again, as the highest form of worship or to worship. Whereas Christ is saying to all nationalities, love your neighbor, serve others, welcome the stranger, care for the poor, care for the sick, be a peacemaker. For God so loved the world. The most famous Bible verse, the most famous statement that people, you go to football games, is John 3:16. For God so loved the world. Not God love the one nation, not God love the one people. And here's Jesus coming in the Jewish tradition, because Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jewish man living in Galilee, preaching in Capernaum, going to Jerusalem. He's fully in the context. He doesn't go to church, he goes to synagogue, right? So Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, is bringing this language that was not common for the Jewish people of that time. It's outside of the norm, and it's incredible that it's still outside of the norm for you and for me. That Jesus is saying, you want to set yourself up first. You want to set your nation as number one. And listen, I have no problem. I'm Puerto Rican. We have zero problem with celebrating our culture. We absolutely love it. I could tell you about Maripili, but you guys wouldn't know what I'm talking about. I mean, we have things like this Puerto Rican lady is in this Mexican game show and she wins and we lose our minds. We're all like the flag of Maripili. It doesn't matter if we like her or not, if we've heard her name or not. Is she Puerto Rican? We're celebrating. There were thousands of people on the street welcoming this lady who won a game show on TV that means nothing for nobody in Puerto Rico, but because she was Puerto Rican representing Puerto Rico, we're all like, yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. When was it? 2016, the Olympics, when Monica Puig, she's like a Puerto Rican tennis player. It's the first time ever Puerto Ricans have won a gold medal in the Olympics. La Borinqueña, which is our national anthem, started playing. National anthem. And I'm like bawling my eyes out. My kids are like, what's happening with daddy? Because I'm crying so hard because this is the first time ever that a Puerto Rican has won a gold medal at the Olympics. There's nothing wrong with celebrating culture. I think it's extremely godly to celebrate culture if we're not celebrating like above of other cultures. I have the privilege of being immersed in multiple cultures in my own home because I'm Puerto Rican. We live in Puerto Rico. But my wife's from Sheffield, England, and she really British. I'm talking Harry Potter accent. I'm talking the whitest skin in our whole community. I'm talking very proper British. Her finger goes up when she's having tea. That's how British she is. And her parents are even more British than she is. And our daughter's from Ethiopia. She comes literally from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Her first language was Amharic, and she's black because she's African. And so there's no denying that within the context of our own family, we got two boys. One was born in Sheffield, England. One was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he'll tell me very proudly, yo soy el gringo aquí. I'm the American here. I was born in North Carolina. I'm from Chapel Hill. And so there's 5 people in our home. There's the Puerto Rican who's very proud to be Puerto Rican, with the British lady, with the Ethiopian daughter, with the other boy who was born in Sheffield, but really wants to be, he's like, yo soy boricua. And then the kid that was born in North Carolina, he's like, I'm from Chapel Hill, Dad. And so within the context of my dinner table, even though yo soy boricua, pa' que tú lo sepa, I love Puerto Rico, I love celebrating Puerto Ricans, I love our culture, I love our food, I love our beach, I love who we are as a people. Above it all, Jesus. Above everything, service, serving others, loving my neighbor. Above everything, how does the main culture, which is, to me, if you can verbalize it, the culture of the kingdom, can rule in this space? So Christian nationalism is a contradiction because Christianity and nationalism will always be clashing as ideologies, as call them faith practices if you want. Because I know people who are Christians or who are very nationalistic. And again, it doesn't just have to be in America, but that's where we see the clearest representation of Christian nationalism. We see it in America, but it's not exclusive to America. But if we think about what a Christian individual would do with power, it would be to surrender it, not to rule over others. What would a Christian individual do with food? Would be to give it away, not to hoard it for himself. What would a Christian individual do with debt? Would be to forgive them. What would a Christian individual do with an offense? Would be to forgive that offense. And so conflicting ideologies, the language of Christian nationalism, I would call it an oxymoron. And I hope you join me next week so we can continue this conversation and see which are the ways, number one, that we struggle with our own nationalism, and number two, what are the solutions to this? This is an actual danger. I need you to understand that it's an actual danger, because there's nothing more dangerous than somebody believing, like truly believing with all their hearts, that what they're doing against others is from God. And we need to call it out. We need to combat it. We need to confront it, and we need to heal from it. Join me next week. Love you guys.